Last year, I quit caffeine and it had this huge impact on my life in ways that I could see and in several other ways that I probably couldn't even notice. Now that I do consume caffeine again on occasion, but recently I have quit again and doing research for this and seeing other videos about caffeine, it's opened my eyes to new realizations about caffeine, why we consume it, and the impact that it can have. Last year, I realized I was addicted to caffeine, or at least addicted to the products or drinks that have caffeine in them. It all originally started out when I was a kid and I would consume about 1 pop a day. Even though it's in small doses, there is still caffeine in them, and I find it kind of wild that parents just openly give them kids drinks that are so bad for them, not just in the caffeine sense, but they also have so much sugar in them, but that's a different story. I then later moved on to caffeine pills later in my life, as I didn't really drink coffee at the time, so I needed something to keep myself awake because I found myself extremely tired at work. So I moved on to caffeine pills, and I found myself taking one of these before every shift that I had. And even though I don't think they work, because I would still go in, I would take the pill and I would find myself dozing off during work. I had found myself popping a pill every single time, and I feel like I kind of sound like a drug addict saying it that way, but even though I found it didn't work, I would still take it before every shift. Then I eventually moved on to pre-workout, and I was working out consistently every single day in the morning. So before every workout, I would need to get a pre-workout scoop in. What this would equate to is approximately 200 to 400 milligrams of caffeine just from that single scoop, and depending on which pre-workout I went with. Shortly after introducing myself to pre-workout, I started working afternoons and I needed something to keep me awake because I kept dozing off. Up until that point, I'd never drank coffee in my life and I needed a remedy to keep me awake, so I started drinking coffee before every shift that I went into work. At this point, I was still taking my pre-workout in the morning, and then I was adding an additional coffee later in the day, so I was approximately consuming 300 to 500 milligrams of caffeine. Then I moved away. I didn't have my usual hookup at the supplement store that I would get my pre-workout at that I was fairly addicted to. And before I left, I started drinking Bangs, and I had a few of them. And I went to Costco one day, saw they sold 24 packs of Bangs, and I'm like, this is made to be. Started buying Bangs there, and that became my new pre-workout, and I would consume that every single morning. I later found out that Bangs had a lot more caffeine in them than I originally anticipated. I thought they only had around 50 to 100 milligrams of caffeine, but it turns out they actually have 300 milligrams of caffeine. The one main thing in common with all these and me consuming caffeine is that it's become a habit. Originally, I had the habit of coming home after school and I would drink a pop every day. Then the habit turned into me taking a pill before work. Then the habit turned into me taking pre-workout before every morning for my workout. And then it turned into me making a coffee before work. And then it turned into me drinking Bangs every single morning before my workout. Then most recently, myself making a coffee after my sister makes one because the machine's already out and she just made one, so I got in the habit of making one after she did. I've seen this struggle with sleep in the past, and even though I'm in a good sleep routine, I go to sleep around the same time, I wake up around the same time, I still toss and turn quite a bit at night. I wake up tired, I'm tired throughout the day, and over the last few years, health has started to become a higher priority in my life. I wanted to see if caffeine had any impact on my sleep and if I could improve my sleep if I quit caffeine. I made a video going over my year finding of quitting caffeine and what I thought of it, so you can watch that. Now that it's been after a year of me quitting, going back to caffeine, and recently quitting again, these are some of the realizations that I've found in some of the different studies that I've read over the past few weeks about coffee and caffeine. After my last video on caffeine, it seems like there's a lot of people that go through these different caffeine videos and talk about all the different side effects and how bad caffeine actually is. A lot of the information that I was getting is that it's big corporations and they're just trying to profit off this industry. They don't talk about all the side effects and how bad caffeine actually is. They just say a safe amount of caffeine to consume is no more than 400 milligrams. If they say you shouldn't consume a certain amount of something, it's probably not good for you. You can make the argument that almost everything's good for you as long as you do it within moderation. Moderation is key, but let's dive into some of the different effects that caffeine can have on you and your body. One caffeine fact that you'll often hear is that caffeine has a half-life of 5 to 6 hours. That means if you consume 100 milligrams of caffeine, you're still gonna have 50 milligrams of caffeine 5 to 6 hours later. And then additionally on top of that, that caffeine has another half-life of 5 to 6 hours. So that 50 milligrams 5 to 6 hours later is only at 25 milligrams and is still in your system 12 hours later. And that's often why you'll hear people say, don't consume coffee or caffeine after noon. It'll most likely still be in your system when you go to sleep at night, and that's going to cause you to be restless while you sleep. You may not think it or feel the effects, but caffeine spikes your adrenaline. What caffeine causes is a neural excitation in the brain, which the pituitary gland perceives as an emergency and stimulates the adrenal glands to release adrenaline. So this is basically the cause of the energy that you receive when you consume caffeine. Next, caffeine in the morning interferes with our higher levels of cortisol production. Cortisol is a hormone that we naturally produce, which helps us feel alert and awake. Our bodies produce most of this during the morning, and it declines throughout the day. When you start consuming caffeine during this period when your body naturally produces it, it starts to rely on that caffeine and stops producing it naturally. This is just something that I read online, and if you do still want to consume caffeine, the optimal times to not have the overlap when you consume caffeine and when your body's naturally producing cortisol is between 10 a.m. and noon, and then another time between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. When I read this online, it made me think about those times during the day where we have these afternoon slumps, and outside of those times is when we're building cortisol, and then we don't really have those slumps, but during those times is when those slumps usually happen. So it makes sense as when those slumps come because our body's not producing the cortisol. However, we're all different and have different schedules, so this is probably just the average time for the average individual that wakes up at an average time, where some people might wake up earlier or some people might wake up later, and their cortisol times are going to be slightly different than that, but this is just what I read online. What I started to notice once I started consuming caffeinated drinks again is that it's basically all habitual, and there's a trigger event that causes it. When I was a kid, the trigger event was me coming home after school. I would drink the pop. The next trigger event was me before I was going into work. I would take a caffeinated pill. The next event was me taking pre-workout before I would go to the gym. Next, it was me taking the coffee before I would go into work. And next, it was the bang before I would work out in the morning. And then the last trigger event was my sister taking out the coffee maker to make her coffee, and that was the trigger events. So knowing that it's a trigger event and it's become a habit, I'm wondering what your trigger event and habits are. Is it just waking up in the morning and you gotta have your morning cup of coffee? Is it before the gym like myself? Or is it just that before work coffee? Or is it the break coffee? Let me know in the comments below what your trigger event and habit is. So basically what I've concluded from quitting caffeine and then going back onto caffeine is that there's a trigger event and it's a habit, and majority of the time that I'm consuming caffeine, it's because it's out of a habit. The trigger event happens and then the habit kicks in. So if you want to quit caffeine, you got to realize what that trigger event is and the habit. The best way to eliminate a habit is to realize the habit and then replace it with something else, or just having the willpower to resist it. There are many negative effects around the topic of consuming caffeine, and I probably didn't even scratch the surface, but there's this huge industry of global giants, and they want you to consume caffeine because it's generating them so much money and profit. They don't really want you to hear about all the negative effects that caffeine can have on you, or maybe you do know them and it's just become so addictive that it's hard to quit at this point. You can try and slowly ease back on it, just slowly cutting it out of your life, or maybe it's switching to decaf coffee instead of caffeinated coffee. There are several different ways that you can go about quitting coffee, but first you got to realize that trigger event and the habit, and then you got to start either replacing it or just having the willpower to say no and resist it, and maybe going cold turkey. Once you do quit, you're going to realize so many different benefits, and there's probably going to be so many other different benefits that you don't even realize, but it's just having a healthy impact on your body. At first, you might be a little bit tired throughout the days, but I think over time, you're going to be able to overcome it. You're going to come up with other solutions instead of going with caffeine. Maybe you're going to go outside for a walk or go exercise, or maybe it's just getting up and walking to your kitchen and back. There's going to be several different ways that you can remedy being tired and how you can overcome it. After quitting caffeine for a year and now in the process of quitting again, one of the biggest factors is just eliminating all the temptation of coffee or caffeine within your house. Put as many steps or barriers in front of you and caffeine, and that's going to make it a little bit easier for you because you're not going to want to go out of your way to get caffeine. I've found that you're able to survive off not consuming caffeine. It's just going to take some time to get there and realize what works and what doesn't. You'll find different workarounds, what works for you and what doesn't work for you, on how to stay awake on those draining days. If you're able to quit, you'll thank yourself later, and I think your teeth will thank you as well. I hope you're able to quit or cut back on the amount of caffeine. Now go out there and enjoy some quality sleep.